In your assessment, how significant are these two references by Josephus? Highly significant, Yamauchi replied, especially since his accounts of the Jewish war have proved to be very accurate. For example, they've been corroborated through archaeological excavations at Masada, as well as by historians like Tacitus. He's considered to be a pretty reliable historian, and his mentioning of Jesus is considered extremely important. Jesus had just mentioned the most important Roman historian of the first century, and I wanted to discuss what Tacitus had to say about Jesus and Christianity. Could you spell out what he corroborates? I asked. Yamauchi nodded. Tacitus recorded what is probably the most important reference to Jesus outside the New Testament, he said. In AD 115, he explicitly states that Nero persecuted the Christians as scapegoats to divert suspicion away from himself for the great fire that had devastated Rome in AD 64. Yamauchi stood and walked over to a shelf, scanning it for a certain book. "Ah, yes, here it is," he said, withdrawing a thick volume and leafing through it until he found the right passage, which he then read to me. Nero fastened the guilt and afflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hatred against mankind. I was already familiar with that passage, and I was wondering how Yamauchi would respond to an observation by a leading scholar named J.N.D. Anderson. He speculates that when Tacitus says this mischievous superstition was checked for the moment, but later again broke out, he was unconsciously bearing testimony to the belief of early Christians that Jesus had been crucified, but then rose from the grave. I said, "Do you agree with him?" Yamauchi thought for a moment. "This has certainly been the interpretation of some scholars," he replied, seeming to duck my request for his opinion. But then he made a crucial point. Regardless of whether the passage had this specifically in mind, it does provide us with a very remarkable fact, which is this. Crucifixion was the most abhorrent fate that anyone could undergo, and the fact that there was a movement based on a crucified man has to be explained. How can you explain the spread of a religion based on the worship of a man who had suffered the most ignominious death possible? Of course, the Christian answer is that he was resurrected. Others have to come up with some alternative theory if they don't believe that. But none of the alternative views, to my mind, are very persuasive. I asked them to characterize the weight of Tacitus's writings concerning Jesus. This is an important testimony by an unsympathetic witness to the success and spread of Christianity, based on a historical figure, Jesus, who was crucified under Pontius Pilate, he said. And it's significant that Tacitus reported that an immense multitude held so strongly to their beliefs that they were willing to die rather than recant. I knew that another Roman, called Pliny the Younger, had also referred to Christianity in his writings. He corroborated some important matters too, didn't he? I asked. That's right. He was the nephew of Pliny the Elder, the famous encyclopedist who died in the eruption of Vesuvius in AD 79. Pliny the Younger became governor of Bithynia in northwestern Turkey. Much of his correspondence with his friend, Emperor Trajan, has been preserved to the present time. Yamauchi pulled out a photocopy of a book page, saying, in Book 10 of these letters, he specifically refers to the Christians he has arrested. Quote, I have asked them if they are Christians, and if they admit it, I repeat the question a second and third time, with the warning of the punishment awaiting them. If they persist, I order them to be led away for execution. For whatever the nature of their admission, I am convinced that their stubbornness and unshakable obstinacy ought not to go unpunished. They also declared that the sum total of their guilt or error amounted to no more than this. They had met regularly before dawn on a fixed day to chant verses alternately amongst themselves in honor of Christ as if to a god, and also to bind themselves by oath, not for any criminal purpose, but to abstain from theft, robbery, and adultery. This made me decide it was all the more necessary to extract the truth by torture from 2 slave women, whom they called deaconesses. I found nothing but a degenerate sort of cult carried to extravagant lengths." End quote. How important is this reference? I asked. Very important. It was probably written about AD 111, and it attests to the rapid spread of Christianity, both in the city and in the rural area, among every class of persons, slave women as well as Roman citizens, since he also says that he sends Christians who are Roman citizens to Rome for trial. And it talks about the worship of Jesus as God, that Christians maintained high ethical standards, and that they were not easily swayed from their beliefs. To me, one of the most problematic references in the New Testament is where the gospel writers claim that the earth went dark during part of the time that Jesus hung on the cross. Wasn't this merely a literary device to stress the significance of the crucifixion, and not a reference to an actual historical occurrence? After all, if darkness had fallen over the earth, wouldn't there be at least some mention of this extraordinary event outside the Bible? However, Dr. Gary Habermas has written about a historian named Thallus, who in AD 52 wrote a history of the Eastern Mediterranean world since the Trojan War. Although Thallus's work has been lost, it was quoted by Julius Africanus in about AD 221, and it made reference to the darkness that the Gospels had written about. Could this, I asked, be independent corroboration of this biblical claim? Explained Yamauchi, in this passage, Julius Africanus says, Thallus, in the 3rd book of his histories, explains away the darkness as an eclipse of the sun, unreasonably as it seems to me. So, Thallus apparently was saying, yes, there had been darkness at the time of the crucifixion, and he speculated it had been caused by an eclipse. Africanus then argues that it couldn't have been an eclipse, given when the crucifixion occurred. Yamauchi reached over to his desk and retrieved a piece of paper. Let me quote what scholar Paul Meyer said about the darkness in a footnote in his 1968 book, Pontius Pilate. He said, reading these words, "This phenomenon, evidently, was visible in Rome, Athens, and other Mediterranean cities. According to Tertullian, it was a cosmic or world event. Phlegon, a Greek author from Caria, writing a chronology soon after 137 AD, reported that in the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, in other words, 33 AD, there was the greatest eclipse of the sun, and that it became night in the 6th hour of the day, that is, noon, so that stars even appeared in the heavens. There was a great earthquake in Bithynia, and many things were overturned in Nicaea." Yamauchi concluded, so there is, as Paul Meyer points out, non-biblical attestation of the darkness that occurred at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. Apparently, some found the need to try to give it a natural explanation by saying it was an eclipse. Yamauchi's mentioning of Pilate reminded me of how some critics have questioned the accuracy of the Gospels because of the way they portray this Roman leader. While the New Testament paints him as being vacillating and willing to yield to the pressure of a Jewish mob by executing Jesus, other historical accounts picture him as being obstinate and inflexible. Doesn't this represent a contradiction between the Bible and secular historians, I asked? No, it really doesn't, said Yamauchi. Meyer's study of Pilate shows that his protector or patron was Sejanus, and that Sejanus fell from power in AD 31 because he was plotting against the emperor. I was puzzled. What does that have to do with anything? I asked. Well, this loss would have made Pilate's position very weak in AD 33, which is most likely when Jesus was crucified, the professor responded. So it would certainly be understandable that Pilate would have been reluctant to offend the Jews at that time and to get into further trouble with the emperor. That means the biblical description is most likely correct. Having talked primarily about Roman corroboration of Jesus, I wanted to turn a corner at this point and discuss whether any other Jewish accounts besides that of Josephus verify anything about Jesus. I asked Yamauchi about references to Jesus in the Talmud, an important Jewish work finished about AD 500 that incorporates the Mishnah, compiled about AD 200. Jews as a whole did not go into great detail about heretics, he replied. There are a few passages in the Talmud that mention Jesus, calling him a false Messiah who practiced magic and who was justly condemned to death. They also repeat the rumor that Jesus was born of a Roman soldier and Mary, suggesting there was something unusual about his birth. So I said, in a negative way, these Jewish references do corroborate some things about Jesus. Yes, that's right, he said. Professor M. Wilcox put it this way in an article that appeared in a scholarly reference work. The Jewish traditional literature, although it mentions Jesus only quite sparingly, and must in any case be used with caution, supports the gospel claim that he was a healer and miracle worker, even though it ascribes these activities to sorcery. In addition, it preserves the recollection that he was a teacher, that he had disciples, 5 of them, and that at least in the earlier rabbinic period, not all of the sages had finally made up their minds that he was a heretic or a deceiver. Although we were finding quite a few references to Jesus outside the Gospels, I was wondering why there were not even more of them. While I knew that few historical documents from the first century have survived, I asked, overall, shouldn't we have expected to find more about Jesus in ancient writings outside the Bible? When people begin religious movements, it's often not until many generations later that people record things about them, Yamauchi said. But the fact is that we have better historical documentation for Jesus than for the founder of any other ancient religion. That caught me off guard. Really, I said. Can you elaborate on that? For example, although the Gathas of Zoroaster, about 1000 BC, are believed to be authentic, most of the Zoroastrian scriptures were not put into writing until after the 3rd century AD. The most popular Parsi biography of Zoroaster was written in AD 1278. The scriptures of Buddha, who lived in the 6th century BC, were not put into writing until after the Christian era, and the first biography of Buddha was written in the 1st century AD. Although we have the sayings of Muhammad, who lived from AD 570 to 632 in the Quran, his biography was not written until 767, more than a full century after his death. So the situation with Jesus is unique and quite impressive in terms of how much we can learn about him aside from the New Testament. I wanted to pick up on that theme and summarize what we had gleaned about Jesus so far from non-biblical sources. Let's pretend we didn't have any of the New Testament or other Christian writings, I said. Even without them, what would we be able to conclude about Jesus from ancient non-Christian sources, such as Josephus, the Talmud, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, and others? Yamauchi smiled. We would still have a considerable amount of important historical evidence. In fact, it would provide a kind of outline for the life of Jesus, he said. Then he went on, raising a finger to emphasize each point. We would know that, first, Jesus was a Jewish teacher. Second, many people believed that he performed healings and exorcisms. Third, some people believed he was the Messiah. Fourth, he was rejected by the Jewish leaders. Fifth, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. Sixth, despite this shameful death, his followers, who believed that he was still alive, spread beyond Palestine so that there were multitudes of them in Rome by AD 64. And seventh, all kinds of people from the cities and countryside, men and women, slave and free, worshipped him as God. This was indeed an impressive amount of independent corroboration. And not only can the contours of Jesus' life be reconstructed apart from the Bible, but there's even more that can be gleaned about him from material so old that it actually predates the Gospels themselves. The Apostle Paul never met Jesus prior to Jesus' death, but he said he did encounter the resurrected Christ and later consulted with some of the eyewitnesses to make sure he was preaching the same message they were. Because he began writing his New Testament letters years before the Gospels were written down, they contain extremely early reports concerning Jesus. So early that nobody can make a credible claim that they had been seriously distorted by legendary development. Luke Timothy Johnson, the scholar from Emory University, contends that Paul's letters represent valuable external verification of the antiquity and ubiquity of the traditions about Jesus. I said to Yamauchi, "Do you agree with him?" We have been talking for quite a while. Yamauchi stood briefly to stretch his legs before settling back down. "There's no question that Paul's writings are the earliest in the New Testament," he said, "and that they do make some very significant references to the life of Jesus." "Can you spell them out?" I asked. "Well, he refers to the fact that Jesus was a descendant of David, that he was the Messiah, that he was betrayed, that he was tried, crucified for our sins, and buried, and that he rose again on the third day and was seen by many people, including James, the brother of Jesus, who hadn't believed in him prior to his crucifixion." It's also interesting that Paul doesn't mention some of the things that are highly significant in the Gospels. For instance, Jesus' parables and miracles. But he focuses on Jesus' atoning death and resurrection. Those, for Paul, were the most important things about Jesus. And indeed, they transformed Paul from being a persecutor of Christians into becoming history's foremost Christian missionary, who was willing to go through all sorts of hardships and deprivation because of his faith. Paul also corroborates some important aspects of the character of Jesus: his humility, his obedience, his love for sinners, and so forth. He calls Christians to have the mind of Christ in the 2nd chapter of Philippians. This is a famous passage in which Paul is probably quoting from an early Christian hymn about the emptying of Christ, who was equal to God, yet took the form of a man, of a slave, and suffered the extreme penalty, the crucifixion. So Paul's letters are an important witness to the deity of Christ. He calls Jesus the Son of God and the image of God. I interrupted by saying, the fact that Paul, who came from a monotheistic Jewish background, worshiped Jesus as God is extremely significant, isn't it? Yes, he said, and it undermines a popular theory that the deity of Christ was later imported into Christianity by Gentile beliefs. It's just not so. Even Paul, at this very early date, was worshiping Jesus as God. I have to say that all this corroboration by Paul is of the utmost importance. And we have other early letters by the eyewitnesses James and Peter, too. James, for instance, has recollections of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. We also have volumes of writings by the Apostolic Fathers, who were the earliest Christian writers after the New Testament. They authored the Epistle of Clement of Rome, the Epistles of Ignatius, the Epistle of Polycarp, the Epistle of Barnabas, and others. In many places, these writings attest to the basic facts about Jesus, particularly his teachings, his crucifixion, his resurrection, and his divine nature. Which of these writings do you consider most significant? I asked. Yamauchi pondered the question. While he didn't name the one he thought was the most significant, he did cite the 7 letters of Ignatius as being among the most important of the writings of the Apostolic Fathers. Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch in Syria, was martyred during the reign of Trajan before AD 117. What is significant about Ignatius, said Yamauchi, is that he emphasized both the deity of Jesus and the humanity of Jesus, as against the Docetic heresy, which denied that Jesus was really human. He also stressed the historical underpinnings of Christianity. He wrote in one letter, on his way to being executed, that Jesus was truly persecuted under Pilate, was truly crucified, was truly raised from the dead, and that those who believe in him would be raised too. Put all of this together. Josephus, the Roman historians and officials, the Jewish writings, the letters of Paul and the Apostolic Fathers, and you've got persuasive evidence that corroborates all the essentials found in the biographies of Jesus. Even if you were to throw away every last copy of the Gospels, you'd still have a picture of Jesus that's extremely compelling. In fact, it's a portrait of the unique Son of God. I stood and thanked Yamauchi for sharing his time and expertise. I know there's a lot more we could talk about since entire books have been written on this topic, I said. But before we end, I'd like to ask you one last question, a personal one, if that's all right. The professor rose to his feet. Yes, that's fine, he said. I glanced around his modest office, which was filled to the brim with books and manuscripts, records and journals, computer disks and papers, all products of a lifetime of scholarly research into a world of long ago. You spent 40 years studying ancient history and archaeology, I said. What has been the result in your own spiritual life? Have your studies bolstered or weakened your faith in Jesus Christ? He looked down at the floor momentarily, then raised his eyes and looked squarely into mine. He said in a firm but sincere voice, "There's no question. My studies have greatly strengthened and enriched my spiritual life. They've given me a better understanding of the culture and historical context of the events. This doesn't mean that I don't recognize that there are some issues that still remain. Within this lifetime, we will not have full knowledge. But these issues don't even begin to undermine my faith in the essential trustworthiness of the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament. I think the alternative explanations, which try to account for the spread of Christianity through sociological or psychological reasons, are very weak." He shook his head. "Very weak." Then he added, "For me, the historical evidence has reinforced my commitment to Jesus Christ as the Son of God who loves us and died for us and was raised from the dead." It's that simple. As I emerged from Yamauchi's building into a sea of college students scurrying from place to place in order to make their next class, I reflected on how satisfying my drive to tiny Oxford, Ohio had been. I came seeking corroboration for Jesus, and I walked away with a rich reservoir of material affirming every major aspect of his life, miracles, deity, and victory over death. I knew that our brief conversation had only scratched the surface. Under my arm, I was carrying the verdict of history, renamed later The Historical Jesus, which I had reread in preparation for my interview. In it, historian Gary Habermas details a total of 39 ancient sources documenting the life of Jesus, from which he enumerates more than 100 reported facts concerning Jesus' life, teachings, crucifixion, and resurrection. What's more, 24 of the sources cited by Habermas, including 7 secular sources and several of the earliest creeds of the Church, specifically concern the divine nature of Jesus. These creeds reveal that the Church did not simply teach Jesus' deity a generation later, as is so often repeated in contemporary theology, because this doctrine is definitely present in the earliest Church, Habermas writes. His conclusion? The best explanation for these creeds is that they properly represent Jesus' own teachings. That is stunning corroboration for the most important assertion by the most influential individual who has ever lived. I zipped up my coat as I headed for my car. Glancing back one more time, I saw the October sun illuminating the stone inscription I had first noticed when I walked onto the campus of this thoroughly secular university. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free.